Good evening, and welcome to the ICST Artist Talk with Atom. I am Micha Seidenberg, I curate events at the ICST. First of all, I would like to give a warm welcome to Atom, dear Uwe. The ICST and I, we are really honored and happy to have you here. Thank you so much for making your trip to Zurich to give us here the ICST Artist Talk at the Zurich University of the Arts. Please a warm welcome for Atom.
Thank you.
I cannot really summarize your career, and I won't. It's better if you talk about your work, but I'd like just to say, I think Atom is one of the most influential artists in electropop, and although he is best known for his electro and techno productions, he has also really pushed creative boundaries in other genres. That's why I think he's considered as a pioneer in the fusion of musical styles, giving rise to entire subgenres in electronic music. Yeah, and also a really impressive number of releases, I think something around 240 or more up to date. But in addition to his consistently outstanding technical precision in sound design, it's his artistic freedom in dealing with different genres and his flexibility in various artistic practices that are particularly impressive. And maybe good examples of more radical works are the albums Liedgut and Widerstand, which were published at the internationally renowned label Raster-Noton. We will not benefit only today from the insights into your work with the Artist Talk, but also through masterclasses, which will be held tomorrow and Thursday. The schedule of these masterclasses that are given to students from the classes of composition, sound engineering, and pop are open to the public, so you are welcome to join us. This schedule is published on the event page of the ZHDK. Yes, just about the talk. The talk will be around about an hour long, and then you will have time for question and answers. And please give me a sign. I will then hand over the microphone. Yes, I'm now really happy to give you the word, and thank you so much. I'm looking very much forward to your talk.
So, very good evening, everybody, and thank you, Micha, for the nice introduction, and to the ICST for the invitation and for having me these days. I would like to maybe annex a little bit to what Micha just said, about give a little introduction into my person, just to give a framework maybe to the topic I would like to talk about, which is the relationship between tools, ideas, and music, and oneself, of course. So this has been a topic which has come up a lot over the last 30 years. In conversations and taking part in panels, artist talks, or conversations with, I don't know, upstarting artists, musicians, and in general conversation also with media and so on. So I was kind of like intrigued by the type of questions that were asked, or that are generally asked when when having to answer within the discourse of like electronic music, what used to be called electronic music. And I soon started to become very curious about finding out myself how my creative process is actually working. Just to give another short side information, I had studied philosophy in Frankfurt without finishing it, but it kind of like, I later realized that this interest in analysis in general is kind of like something that's part of my nature, and I'm just enjoying a lot to figure out things that seemed to be natural, maybe, like this process, which I hadn't really thought about a lot at all at the very beginning. And in the discourse with other people and musicians, like questions like, so how do you do things? One suddenly has to think about, how do I do things? Like, what are the components of the process itself? And like this analysis is more maybe to be understood as an retrospective analysis about the process, not so much about it's not so much a how-to instruction kind of manual. Also, I'm quite aware of maybe the curious path I have taken in the creation of making music, which is not very universal. Maybe it's not a lot of things I'm doing or I've been doing are maybe not compatible to anybody who's making music, because even though music is just one thing, organized sound, there are a lot of different access points to music and interests in music, from, I don't know, being an interpreter to being a composer to being an engineer. And even within those sub-interests, there are very different psychologies, I would say, that determine your interest, your access point into music. And my access point has been very narrow, I would say, but I've always been very interested in fringe phenomena, maybe. And just to give a small introduction in my biography, I started playing drums in a basement, just for myself, and then heard a drum machine on the radio when I was like maybe 13 years old. And I had been very fixated on rhythm, and then heard a drum machine and didn't understand what was going on because it was so perfect. And then, this was like early 80s maybe, I tried to find out what that was that I heard and that sounded so different than from what I was able to do, and found out that there existed drum machines, and I got totally fascinated by the fact that I could do with a piece of equipment something that I could not do physically, or that nobody could do physically, but I could come up with an idea about a rhythm and concretize that idea with a piece of equipment. So I bought a little drum machine from the money my parents gave me, which was like really like a toy kind of thing, like a very cheap, very bad sounding piece of gear. And I programmed that machine with headphones in my room for like maybe a year or two, until I've had basically programmed everything I could imagine with that machine. Then, as I got older, I met different people that also made music, and bought a different drum machine and so on, and we started to make music more like as a hobby, I would say, in the beginning. And I got into programming very strongly, from drum programming into sequencing, and I had no idea about, let's say, engineering, synthesis, basically any other aspect of making music. Like, my access was very playful, I would say, very much like a child starts to play with toys. It was like a very natural path to actually making music, but it had never been an idea of mine to make music, to become a musician or to become a producer or whatever those roles are or those classifications are that didn't really exist for me back then. So actually making the first, recording the first album and making music and then releasing music happened very much as I would consider as an accident. Kind of, I was sort of like dragged into it because other people wanted to do it. And for that very reason, I never had, and I still don't have any ambition in terms of what's usually called a career. Or I never wanted to be something specific. It just suddenly, I looked at myself and I was like, okay, seems like that's what I'm doing. And now I'm a musician or something like that. And over the years, of course, then culturally speaking, this whole environment started to expand and to grow and to become a thing. I don't know, DJ culture, music business, record companies, which I've always considered more like a necessary evil, so to speak. Like, okay, you want to release music, there are labels, you have to deal with it, you have to market yourself, you have to fit into a genre, and so on. And very early on, maybe 2 or 3 years into making music, I realized that there was like a strong pressure onto me about fulfilling certain genre-typical ideas. You have to make, it's not techno enough, it's not that enough, or you know. But I had gotten into music from this very playful angle. For me, it was always about finding things out about the equipment I was using, and I felt like this whole environment kind of like started to put pressure on the artist in terms of fulfilling certain stereotypes and certain ideas. And so this was a moment around 94 maybe where I also started my own label and kind of broke out of this framework. And because like Michael just said, the idea of merging genres, for example, came out of a very, again, playful, and I would say at the core there is playfulness and curiosity about certain things, about basically everything that's part of what I'm doing. So there's the curiosity about the tools, and there's the curiosity about the ideas as well, and about the process that makes that. Of course, curiosity about oneself, like what is happening to yourself in that process, and about also when we talk about the object, which is the music you're making, there's always this interest in you having an idea about something, you concretize it, and then when it's there, when you have materialized it, it's actually something unpredictable. Like you never know what it really does to you. You can think about it, you can conceptualize it, but once it's happening, it becomes like an entity in itself. It also kind of like independent from you. So this whole idea of merging genres came out of this, it was kind of like the outcome of this growing interest in exploring the fringes of ideas and the fringes of tools as well. So in the very beginning, of course, I had no tools, and I'm often also part of this conversation as well. I'm often asked by younger, producers or people who are interested in making music about the tools. This is like, seems to be like, and I've realized that also on festivals and conversations in general, that there has been a very strong emphasis on technology and the misuse of the word technology, meaning tools, hardware, software, gear, stuff. While nobody, or very rarely people ask me about the ideas, or let's say the non-technological side of making music, which has to do with organizing yourself, for example, or discipline, and the idea space, like how do you deal with the ideas? Where do the ideas come from? And very early, when I was just starting, I had no tools. I had the drum machine and the synthesizer and the 4-track recorder for a very long time, and even within the first 4 years, my studio was super tiny because I had no money. And I made actually a lot of music back then, and a lot of very diverse music. And soon realized that in order to compensate the technology, which I didn't have, there was also very little information about technology in general, like not like today, you couldn't like Google drum machines, or it was really like a very slow process of figuring stuff out, talking to colleagues and getting an idea of what there is, especially about engineering or more detailed information about that realm of music production. And I soon realized that, or maybe not, I didn't even realize, I think it was more like an automatic thing that happened, that I started to compensate the lack of tools, or of gear maybe, with ideas. So I realized, for example, after I remember this morning when I had delivered my first album, on which I had worked for 3 years, which was the sole and only thing for like 3 years. I woke up one morning and I had nothing to do because everything was done, and I realized I hadn't thought about that. But and there was like an empty day. I had an empty day and I didn't know what to do next. So I realized that I needed to think about what I wanted to do next, because it didn't automatically fill in. And so I started to actively work a lot on the production of ideas, producing ideas, organizing ideas, besides just organizing the tools, but also making this whole process like a more conscious process. And I think in all this, the 3 points, like the tools, the ideas, and especially the subject itself that makes all that, I discovered that my main interest has always been to explore, and I would like to present that as an important item, that there's the potential which a tool has, the potential which an idea has, and the potential within oneself. And the potential I would normally describe as like a cone, like you are maybe in the center, and the potential, if you look at it, opens up as a cone in front of you. So there has always been the potential in the tool, which is often what has produced artifacts like, for example, clicks and cuts or glitch music, for example, which I was partly involved by accident, I think, but it's also like one of the phenomenon which describe maybe my perspective on the tools, on machines, like in the sense that a specific tool has, of course, a specific purpose. So there is like this very kind of narrow purpose, whatever a sequencer is made to sequence events. So that's like a super narrow, or a drum machine has like that and that potential. And then there is the fringe potential. Then there are the effects that coming out of a certain piece of equipment that nobody has thought about before, and this potential isn't infinite either. It's quite definite actually, but it changes over time as oneself is changing, and as the music one makes is changing, and the ideas are changing. So, for example, you could have a drum machine that was made in the 80s, that was used in a certain way in the 80s and sounded in a certain way in the 80s, and 30 years later you can make very different things with it without actually changing the tool itself. It's just the idea space and like this feedback kind of, or this dynamic evolution. It reinforms the tool, and you can then reach beyond maybe the intended boundaries of the tool. So I had done that naturally, I would say, from the very beginning, because I had no machines basically. So one had to figure out how to realize certain ideas with the tools you had, and you become suddenly very creative with it. It's a very inspiring moment when you realize that there seems to be an equilibrium in that space, in the sense as you can. Happened to me a couple of times. The moment you have too many tools, you need to have less ideas. The moment you have no tools, you need to have more ideas. And there seems to be, I realized that very early, there seems to be some equation. I look upon it like an equation, like it's a lot of variables, and you can modify that system consciously or unconsciously. And depending on this modification, you can modify a little bit the functioning of your idea space, which is mainly, and also the possible output of the object you're creating. So every couple of years, maybe every, I don't know, 7 to 10 years, I had gone, over the last 30 years, I had gone through a moment where I decided to, for example, completely reduce my studio to as little as possible. Like, for example, between 2003 and 2010, I only had a 12-inch laptop. And I did, for example, Senior Coconut on a small laptop that I hadn't hadn't done even any change in the operating system. I had no other machines, just like a little master keyboard and 2 speakers and a computer for almost 10 years, like 7, 8 years. Because I wanted to force myself into that situation where you have as little tools as possible, and you're really forced onto to come up with ideas, become creative with maybe 10 shortcuts or something you have, like in a program like Pro Tools. And you have a bunch of plugins, and you're not really expanding the toolkit either. It's not like a growing thing, it's a very static thing. And then you suddenly come up with ideas on how to really exploit that tool space. And you very soon cross into areas that are often unknown, and they're often unlabeled, I would say, or they don't exist as phenomenon, as musical phenomenon, or as genres, and maybe every now and then they become such, like Glitch, for example, which I don't know was a kind of like a strange thing to happen at that time, like around 2001 or 2003, and I've always then considered this process, of course, as a dynamic process in which the processing of all those components should be seen, in my opinion, as a transformational process in which you change all the components in that process by just running it. So, for example, a specific musical outcome can inform, again, a tool you have. Suddenly you see, like, oh, I did this in a certain way, so how does that in the future interact with the tools I have? And it may inform you for to a different use of the tool, and especially informs your idea space. And so I began, and I would like to play maybe 2 tracks to demonstrate that, in which the exploration of an idea space and the tool idea space produces a certain phenomenon, and the phenomenon then, through the process itself, helps you to transform and inform the idea space into a new object, basically. So there was, for example, when I started working with machines, there was, in the very beginning, of course, there was no hard disk recording, and there was no, it was all MIDI or analog and very manual, actually, and it was very, very difficult to come up with a certain type of precision which I was interested in. And so I had learned tape editing, and I was programming a lot, like sequencers, and it was all MIDI and very time intensive, a lot of energy and focus on getting in my mind, very simple things to happen. And then suddenly, in the early 90s, hard disk recording kind of became affordable. And but I didn't actually, I knew tape editing, which is destructive, and then suddenly there was like hard disk recording, which was non-destructive to a certain degree, and this kind of like suddenly like this was happening. I had this in mind for a long time, making more precise rhythms and tighter production, and then suddenly the tool was there, and I had the idea, of course, what I wanted to do, but I didn't know what that actually meant. So in general, back then and still today, there's always a lot of music I make which I would consider, how do you say, tests maybe. You explore this thing without actually knowing what's coming out. There's a lot of music in my catalog which I would consider that, which is something very different from a more, more focused production maybe. And back then, a track I would like to play now, this was one of the first pieces of music I made with an 8-track digital recorder, hard disk recorder, from an album called Schnittstelle, which means interface, but also the point where you do the edit, because I was very interested in editing, and I was not so keen on MIDI, for example. I always found MIDI very tedious and not very precise, and I really wanted to get rid of MIDI in terms of precision and this aspect. So I made an album which was called Schnittstelle, which was only about myself exploring the abilities or the capabilities or the realm of edits. And I had come up with a work, with an idea about how I would like to use the tool, which, and I have to say the 8-track recorder had one undo. So you made a cut, and then you could listen to the cut and think about it, if it was okay or not. And the moment you did the next operation, this undo was gone. So you could not, if you made a mistake, you could not go back. But I had a training in tape editing where every cut, because it's destructive, you have to be very focused on that. So it wasn't, I was kind of like trained coming from tape. So it was not like a big deal, but of course you have to take the peculiar nature of the tool into consideration when you come up with how to implement the idea. So what I did was I had very few machines, or maybe like 2 samplers and a sequencer and a synthesizer, and I decided to program a bit in a certain BPM, in a certain mood, mix it down stereo, record it as a stereo block, and then wipe what I just did and program something else that may or may not be connected to it, and then cut it together and see what happens and see how that feels. Because, I mean, like I said, you can imagine how that may sound, but it's really hard to really imagine it until you hear it, to hear the edit, you hear what's happening, like also emotionally, or how you feel the music. So the whole album was basically exploring that space of digital editing. I will play this track and then go to the next. The track is called Hallmarke. I'm quite fortunate that I can torture the world with these ideas. And I just remember that, of course, this process meant that when the track was finished, like I gave myself a certain task, let's say 4 minutes, I don't know, 3 minutes, 5 minutes, let's see how far I can go. And once the track was finished, it had also become like a surprise to me, like I could not have conceived that, or I did not even want to have conceived that prior to starting the process. So it was kind of like a slow motion improvisation in a way, where you splice stuff together and then you listen to the whole thing, and it has this peculiar structure and a peculiar sensation which I really enjoyed not having known before. So kind of like this kind of exploration, like you suddenly see this object that came out of that peculiar process, and then by doing that you understand a little bit what you could come up with, like it informs your idea space, and gives you actually a new approach to the very same tool you had just used, just by using it, and by doing these kind of processes over and over and over, because basically what I think is important in this constellation, or in the creative process in general, is doing a lot of things all the time. That's what I think is maybe the most important aspect of being creative, independent from whether you think you're failing or you're successful or whatever that means. Just by doing, and that's why my catalog is so big, I think. There's not a single day where I'm not doing something that's somehow related to that. Not necessarily making music, but also like ideas, working on ideas and so on. And I would like to play a second song which was produced shortly after. This one came out in 1998, and the album that came out after that is called Pop Artificiel. It's from 1999, but I had started to work on it maybe 94 onwards. And the song I'm gonna play is a cover version of the Rolling Stones song Angie, which was also produced the same way, the same equipment, also basically programming. The portion I was able to program depended on the memory the sampler had, so I had 32 megabyte of sample space, and once that was reached, I had to record that block, and in that particular process I decided to wipe the memory, because the pure management, the memory management would have taken longer than actually making the music, so I decided not to store stuff, and because it would mean a lot of like admin just to figure out what I had done earlier in the day, and I decided that this was not worth it. So basically I programmed, let's say 4 or 8 bars, wiped the sampler, recorded it, wiped the sampler, and then kept recording, and then edited with the same method. I had one undo. And the idea was to reproduce the song Angie by the Rolling Stones with synthetic means, maintaining the original velocity, the BPMs of the original track, which are of course fluctuating, using very simple, like a MIDI sequencer. The idea was to reach the maximum level of complexity with the very limited setup I had. This one is shorter. For all the Rolling Stones fans. So there are actually two components to this song and to the album. There's of course, like what I just talked about, the tool side of it. So when I started to work on this song, just the same as the track before, I had no idea about how that would feel when it's done. Like, what does it do? I wasn't specifically that interested in the song itself. Like, I don't like the Rolling Stones particularly, and I found that song always very like cheesy, and I was like, okay, let's try to mechanize that kind of musical phenomenon, like a rock song from the Stones, and transform it into. I had a very clear idea of what I wanted to do with it, but I had no idea really if it would work, let's say. So in the time before that particular production, I of course played around a lot with this process here, like shown with the track before, as in getting used to how does the tool behave, which are maybe the bugs of the tool, or which are like these phenomenon that are not within the that are outside the supposed potential of the tool. Like it's a tape editor and it's a sequencer and it's a drum machine, but what more can you do? and exploring that. So in the moment of executing that particular idea, I had a much better understanding of where this could hopefully lead me to, and also the production of the tracks before had already like given me more like an idea of the outcome of what I wanted to do. So and then there's this other layer besides the tool space, which is of course you're taking a pop song from the 70s and kind of like violated. At least that's how it came across in 1999 that way. And that's like this other layer where you have an idea space that then kind of like resulted in a very long phase of which Senior Coconut is like one example. I found great interest in not only splicing audio, but also splicing genre ideas, or splicing ideas maybe in a more general sense, which also came from sampling, working with sampling, and then suddenly hardest recording, it wasn't used really, it was used a little bit, but it was like pre-hardest recording, I would say, like very crude and very simple. But hardest recording kind of like opened this whole idea of sampling. Like suddenly sampling exploded like this because the samples became bigger. And so it became possible for me to actually splice genre ideas. Like this one, for example, was, okay, electronic music, if you want to call it like that, and a pop song from the 70s, which was a very unhip thing to do at that time. And a lot of people didn't like it at all. But at the same time, it kind of, for me, it was kind of like a revelation as well, a personal revelation in the sense of that what came out of that in terms of reaction and also like the personal experience with the music, like when I listened to the music and all back then when I did, kind of like suddenly again informs the idea space, like, okay, this is what you can do, this is how it works, and from that experience then you can again reinterpret the tool. So of course then the tool space, by having done that once, you start like exploring the tool space in the sense of like what, where's the limit of that tool space, because now I have another idea, and can I keep doing this with this tool space? And I will not play the Senior Coconut album or tracks from the Senior Coconut album today, but this came out a year later in 2000, where I had, this is related to Pop Artificiel, whereby I would not see Pop Artificiel as an exercise for Senior Coconut, but it came out of the same interest, in which the idea was to reassemble Kraftwerk songs out of snippets of Latin records. This was also without hardest recording, in a 32 megabyte sampler. So it was like cutting up stuff and programming it back together, so I got Kraftwerk songs out of it, which was like a super time-intensive process, but also because I was informed about this, about the possible outcome, it was kind of like I was able to structure it kind of mentally, get an idea about the workload, the time I would need, the complexity this would take, also things like how to organize yourself becomes very important, like administrating the tools and your ideas. So over the years, basically, this whole process kind of like got more and more sophisticated, I would say, in the sense that but it's still a very organic, I would even say not very rational process, in which I slowly started to incorporate maybe more complex, workflows. And where I would also say that when we talk about tools and we often we think about stuff, we think about synthesizers and mixing desks and stuff. But to me, in the idea space, there's a lot of tools are actually in the idea space, like soft tools or psychic tools, which are often equally important to the stuff you're using, or even if it's software, I mean like gear, machines, external machines. Like you have internal machines and you have external machines, maybe something like that. So as time went by, and we're now in the year 2001 or something like that, this had become like very complex in the sense that I was able to construct certain types of workflow, which to me still belong more to the idea space when you create a workflow. And you're realizing, you're becoming aware of a certain dynamic. So you can start building a workflow with a higher awareness about what is really going on there. And one important thing I wanted to mention is that I had become there was a moment where I had become a little bit carried away by the tool space, for example, only to realize that it had kind of like broken my workflow. Maybe you have realized or experienced that. Like suddenly you get a new operating system and nothing works, or you have to relearn your shortcuts. So there's like this, especially today or within the last maybe 5 years, I felt that a lot. You have like a very accelerated evolution of the tool space, where new stuff is coming out and asking you to replace the old stuff, which is of course always a temptation, and in most cases, or I would say, or in many cases at least, useful and recommended. But I had this moment twice over the last 30 years that I got kind of like carried away by the temptation of the tool space, and it completely broke my workflow, where I was basically handicapped for like maybe a month or two by like relearning certain things or trying to figure out how to make this this whole thing work again. So I had opted for a more conservative approach with the tools, and basically the last I decided to freeze my computer, for example, for like at least 7 to 10 years, and just don't touch it. It's not online. It's just that thing. Ignoring for a long time the temptations, let's say the economic temptations, to change the tool space, whereby over the last years maybe I have loosened that up a little bit, because it's really tempting, especially within the last 5 years. The technology has come out, has been really incredible. But I've also, of course, realized how this is affecting the idea space, in the sense of that you may have realized that in order to be able to implement a tool into an idea, you need to spend some time with a tool. It's and this is unavoidable. There's no shortcut really to that. Like, we are bound to the real-time, to our real-time experience. So where things become, I'm very interested always in making things haptically automatic. So a lot of things I don't want to think about. I don't want to have to mentalize them before engaging in them. So a lot of things I do is just like making stuff, so the workflow becomes partly automatic. So all the stuff you don't really want to think about, they just happen. The moment you don't have time for the tool, this is almost impossible. Like, you're confronted with like the like a virgin moment. Every day you're working with a new tool, you kind of like have to learn it again, and you never really explore the fringe of the potential of a tool, which I've still always considered like coming back to playfulness and curiosity, which I still consider like the most exciting moment when working with tools of that type, to be able, after you've gone through over the threshold of understanding the basics and making it work in your idea space, then to see where are the fringes of that tool, and does that outcome, like the borderline, behavior of a tool, does that eventually do something here, like in your idea space, like this? And by doing this over and over again, you suddenly become a feeling for a tool. You're slowly getting a feeling for a tool. And I, for example, the idea is often, and this is, I think I'm very interested and I'm doing that basically to create a moment where, in the moment you have an idea, I already think of this with this in mind. Like I already know how to implement which tool in which degree to reach a certain effect I want to realize here. So a big portion of my process now, very different maybe from 15, 20 years ago, I would say that I think about the process 80% of the time, and then I do it mechanically, let's say, 20% of the time. So I very often construct mentally this kind of like flow chart of like what's the idea, which tools do I have, and how long, what's the interaction between the two. And then I get a very good idea of like how long this is going to take, how easy it's going to be. And of course there's always the unknown somewhere where to me it's very important to have within that super mentalized process a void. There's always some moment where I want to be surprised by all this. So has always been a very conscious decision about not over-informing myself. This is also why I've never studied anything music-related. Have figured all this out by myself. And I've always, when I come across teaching or recommendations or how to, user manual and so on, I try not to take it in. I try to approach all this experiencing it, because I find it very hard to unlearn something concerning the behavior of like the how-to, like this kind of music is done that way and it functions this way and so on, or I don't know, this compressor is for this and for that and it does this and for it's kind of course it's not irrelevant, but to some degree it's also not that important. And I found that I had to balance a little bit like this the input relationship, like signal-noise relationship to this process. And very often I prefer to be more like ignorant when it comes to even music. Like for example, I don't know much music. I don't listen to music. I'm more like interested in encountering music, like in a taxi, in an airplane, or I don't know, anywhere basically, more than studying music. So I've always found that innocence kind of liberating, rather than over-informing, especially in the tool space. I mean, nowadays it's kind of very easy to be informed about everything in a quite detailed manner. So I think wrapping it up, maybe I think that's the time, right? Opening for Q&A. So this is my little my little explanation on my personal workflow and my relationship with tools, ideas, and music. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Uwe. So we now have time for questions. Yes, over there's a question.
Yeah, thanks a lot for this beautiful artist talk. As you've been pointing out, I mean, we're in a development of instruments over time, and making music has been accompanied by this process. And you said in the last 5 years there have been so much development, but on the other hand, aren't we just recreating what was invented, like synthesizer-wise, or also instruments? That if we would have stayed with the same equipment, or like with tape, old synthesizers and stuff, we could have also come into a new realm of creating ideas without new technologies. Or you really think those last 5 years were crucial for new sounds?
I don't think they are crucial, but I think they're very different from. I mean, I picked 5 years like as an approx. I don't know. So what I think what has changed over the last 20 years is that we have a lot of tools, much more tools than before. But when you talk about this, the fact that there has not been much development in terms of musical phenomena, maybe, or when you talk about sound or genres, it's kind of like we're kind of like in a recycling circle where we cannot break out, because we have. I have a theory about this. We have been frozen in the idea space. So because this is so big, this has become so small that we are constantly, and of course also the music we produce is like there's so much music coming out, which is also by definition generic. So kind of like this, and this is kind of like pressing the idea space down. So we have, I think we as humans have a cognitive incapacity to break through the horizon of imagination, because this is kind of like pushing that horizon down. We are constantly fed with how things are and how things used to be, like history and basically history and the current present. So it's really, really difficult to break out of the to expand the idea space, which has always been super interesting to me, because I'm looking at it from. I'm looking at this development since ever, I would say, and I'm super surprised. At some point, I was like very shocked about the stagnation of electronic music, where at some point I was. This is also why I don't use the word anymore, because I kind of like decided that it doesn't exist anymore. How at some point this very extreme acceleration of new genres and new musical ideas went into this strange loop, while the technology is actually pretty incredible, and there's a much bigger amount of people working on sound tools or music tools. There's a lot of like very strange there are a lot of very strange machines available, strange ideas, strange concepts, which sort of, and this is kind of like surprising, don't produce corresponding ideas. So I cannot tell you exactly what the reason is beyond this kind of like crude analysis. But I really do think that there's I mean, we can also talk about artificial intelligence and, music generation through LLMs and stuff like that, which are also pretty, in my opinion, pretty amazing beyond the generic aspect of it. But I think there's a lot happening in this moment to music. I'm just not that sure that it's coming from humans. So I think we're having a problem here with the idea space.
Do Do you like your own music?
I like it a lot when I'm doing it, and then there's a short moment, there's a brief moment, maybe like a week, where I really enjoy it, and then I totally don't like it anymore. But it's also interesting because over 10 years ago, I had decided to remaster my catalog to make it available and stuff like that. It was like more like a very pragmatic decision. And so I was forced to listen to my entire catalog, which in general I was not looking forward to, and I tried to look at it like a really technical task. And I realized I had a lot of fixed ideas about certain things I had done, like, oh, I really liked this, and I never liked that. And then when re-encountering it, I was often surprised about liking stuff I thought I hadn't liked, and the other way around. But then the next day, I didn't like it again. So I realized that I think I have no objective opinion about my music. Like I can't talk about it like a neutral listener would talk about it, let's say. And so it's like a little bit like you don't really want to read your diary. You know, you had written like 10 years ago. It's kind of like embarrassing. So it's a little bit like that. It's okay. I've done it. I really liked it for a short time. But for me, the most important thing actually is having a good time doing this. Like I really enjoy making music, and I think it's the best thing ever. So and what's coming out of it, it's of course not irrelevant. It's super important, but I also know that it's a little bit beyond predictions, or at some point you have to let go, and then it's just what you've done. And then I also lose my opinion about it. Like I really don't know, and then it's better to check the box and go to something else.
To the question from before, the ideas, if we imagine them somewhere like in the Plato world, idea world, we need to incorporate them. So you said you see your workflow in the idea space, that you don't have to think too much, that the ideas can come through quite directly. So maybe this is also like a programming yourself. Do you see techniques like in this book of classical music theory that explains how to make them concrete? Do you also put them in the idea space or in the tool space? I mean, or do you think it's necessary to have all these techniques, like knowing about how chord progressions work, or do you only want to have your own vocabulary?
Again, I think that I'm very aware about my peculiar idea about this. So I personally, I'm rather not interested in those ideas, but this depends really on what's your entry point, like what you want to do. So I think it's completely subjective. For me, it's not important. When you talk about the enabling, if I well understood, the enabling of ideas, like how do you get ideas? I mean, this is also maybe very peculiar, but I constantly have ideas, which is also a little bit annoying. So maybe I'm on the spectrum or something, I don't know. But it's really hard for me to not have ideas. So I rather have to work on not having ideas, because otherwise it's getting a little bit overwhelming organizing it and stuff like that. But for example, when I go to the studio with a certain plan for that day, and I know that I need an idea, whatever, or very often you may know when you make music, there are days which are better than other days where you don't, where things flow, and other days it just doesn't work and you don't know why. Which is also, I think, something very, I think almost impossible to explain or to analyze, like why this is. But I've realized that it has to do maybe with, I don't know, how you're, with your emotions, maybe your mental state, very important if you have slept enough, like if you're tense or not, and so on. So I consider the having ideas is you having a muscle after a while for cultivating ideas and make them happen, make them, you know, appear. And I've been always very sensitive to that process. Like I know that you can break the process. Often I've seen this with colleagues and friends and musicians that have lost the ability to make music, for example. Very creative people that suddenly just had no idea, they lost like their creative potential. So I'm very, very aware about the fact that this is a very delicate condition. And I've always been very interested in shaping my day according to that aspect. Like there are days I know, for example, that I don't need ideas, and I behave differently than on days where I need to have one or have some, or at least enable it. So I always consider my daily routine like for myself. I often describe it as a kind of like a ballet. Like it's like you do this and then you drink a coffee and then you do that, and at some point you feel like you're ready to enter into that you know, into that workflow. And I have a pretty good feeling after all these years to enable that, or I also know when it's completely useless, you know. But I'm more interested in having ideas. I wouldn't even say, I mean, maybe language is suggesting the wrong thing, because we're always talking about I'm having an idea. And my favorite Swiss person, by the way, Carl Gustav Jung, he said, the idea is having me. So I'm kind of like more intrigued by that thought, because very often when you're forced to think about an idea, and ideas can be big and small, they can be very simple, they can be very complex, they can be fuzzy. It's very hard to say, I mean, I cannot do this with good conscience and say, oh, I'm having an idea. It's very often like, okay, there's an idea, honestly, I don't know why I had it or why it's there. And very often you also see that things you believed were yours are actually not. So there's, because other people have the same idea, you know, and so it's kind of like in this, if you come back to Plato, it's kind of like, okay, there is something in your mind that you describe as an idea, and you kind of try to express it, but you don't really know where it's coming from. It's certainly coming from, I don't know, enabling it and becoming like more sensitive to it, because you're not having any idea. I mean, I'm not having mathematical ideas, I'm having musical ideas. So it's kind of like you're training yourself to that particular circumstance, I would say.
I would be really interested how you make kind of aesthetical choices, because I think, I mean, you worked a lot with samples then, and when I heard this music, it had kind of an aesthetic for me, and this process sounds kind of really technical somehow. So yeah, this would be interesting for me.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think when you, this is more like, has to do with the idea, for example. So very often when I have a specific imagination about the music I want to do, I try, not always, I try to break it down in also aesthetic components, like not only the tools. That's why I think it's this is much more, to me it's much more interesting. For example, the first track we heard, for example, one component on this album was, is there humor, is there no humor? Is it kind of, how do you say, hard or difficult to digest? Is it nice, is it polite, is it rough, is it I don't know, these kind of like aesthetic components. Is it beautiful? Is it ugly? And I've always been very interested in operating these parameters and kind of like figuring out these parameters for myself, especially if you talk about aesthetics and you talk about beauty and the aesthetic choices you take. Like you do something, and this is very fascinating to me almost every day in the studio. You do something very quickly and you take an aesthetic choice. You take an aesthetic choice by using this kick drum or this EQ or this reverb. It's always you take you without thinking about it, decide that this is better than the other one, and you kind of like your condition or who you are kind of drives into a certain aesthetic outcome, I would say, which has to do with, hard to say. I mean, why do you like red more than blue? I don't know. It's just, can you retrain that? Kind of hard for most things that are aesthetic. You know, what do you think is beautiful? What do you think is ugly? And I very often, as an idea, try to make music I find ugly. For example, when I feel in the process of taking aesthetic decisions and I come to the crossroad of beautiful, not beautiful, to stop there and take the other road, which is really hard because you're kind of like, it's kind of like, no, it's actually not nice. But then you go there, and I've always been very interested in forcing myself to aesthetic decisions which are not natural to me, to my, reflex, aesthetic reflex. And so normally I try to set these kind of ideas before I start working on something, not always. Sometimes very often I make music, I have no idea, none at all. I just start doing things. And then suddenly the ideas come out. So it's not like I'm always starting from there. It sounds, maybe, I know this talk sounds like a little bit very cerebral, like I'm just sitting there and thinking about it. Very often I don't. And as soon as the ideas kind of like get a little bit clearer, like what do I want to do? Like, is it an album? Is it a track? Is it long? Is it short? Is it, is it friendly? Is it not friendly? Then I try to come up with a very simple set of aesthetic, adjectives, framework, very simple. And whenever I take a decision and I realize I cross that boundary, it helps me to come back to the core condition, so to speak. And so I find in general the aesthetic, that also the first track I played, the interesting thing about this process was that I didn't know aesthetically what would come out of it. So it kind of like was not at all, it was informed by the decision I was taking in the moment, but I had no idea about the overall outcome and then the beauty or non-beauty that came out of it, which was also not undoable, or you couldn't correct it or anything, was also, of course, a surprise to me. But I in general, I like this a lot, to make things that I don't find beautiful or even useful, or I don't know, that surprises me the same way it would surprise you. That's a little bit like a dream scenario. Like I make music and I'm like shocked by it. That's the ideal situation, also in the process of making music.
Thank you so much. It was so inspiring, your talk. I have so many questions. I think I have to pick one. Actually, I was very curious to know, you said, anticipating before a little bit about artificial intelligence, and you said it's kind of an amazing potential. For me, sometimes I'm a little bit unclear, is it in the tool area, or do I place it in the idea, or is it even just a new individuum next to me? You know, like, what's your take on AI tools? Is it even tools, or how should we approach them? Thank you.
Well, I think we're still looking at it as a tool. I think that's the current conception. And when you're playing around with those systems which are called AI, I don't know if they're really, I mean, I don't want to talk about intelligence or whatever, but these very complex systems, not only music, but also text and images, and it's maybe easier to understand with images, what I refer to. Because music is a little bit behind, I would say. It's still a little bit behind the images, the image technology. But what you see in, and I would maybe refer back to this point of that there is an intended purpose of a tool, and then there is the fringe phenomena where we don't know what they do, and we have, like, especially with, I don't know, the large language models, we have come to learn that they suddenly can write code, which they were not intended for. Suddenly the system gives you an output that was not intended for, it was not designed for that, but suddenly it does it. So there's a high potential, I think, in those systems for failing the mark of the intended purpose. Like suddenly you have like all kinds of, because it's a very complex system, you have all kinds of byproducts that come out of it. So when you look at images, for example, you write a prompt, and the prompt is based upon your knowledge and upon your imagination. You cannot prompt something that has never existed before, right? So it's kind of, and you enter into a generic space, like the AI tool was trained on generic data, and then you give it a more or less complex prompt, and it gives you a result that has been kind of like interpolated, or like in a very complex mathematical system being, stochastically produced. And if you look at very old, rather old, like 2, 3, 4-year-old image processors, I played around with it when they came out a lot, because they produced a lot of very bizarre images. Like you would type something, I don't know, something very simple. Like, I know, I gave this example yesterday. Helmut Newton, 1970s art photography, night shot, wide angle. And then suddenly it produces an image which has, you don't see anything on it. It's just like shapes and colors. But if you look from a distance, suddenly you go like, yeah, it's 70s in a way. You don't know why. Like you kind of like, it did that, but in a very bizarre way. If you would now erase the prompt, like the prompt never existed, and somebody would just show you that image, you would be really surprised about the fact that no human being would have been able to come up with that image that would produce that effect. So if you isolate it from the human context, this very specific product the AI has made is in a way more imaginative than the human that could imagine it. The same is true for music. If you play around a little bit with this kind of software, you suddenly realize that you hear, for example, you hear a piano, but you don't hear a piano, because it's kind of like this weird, where it triggers something in you, you kind of recognize a pattern, but there's not really a pattern. It sounds like a drum, but it's not drums, and then the drums are a piano, and it's kind of like this weird zone, where if you would ask me, would you as a human be able to make this? I have to say I don't know how to make a mental model myself with all the technology I have besides AI, so I could do this. So we're entering a stage where the modeling capacity of the general modeling capacity of ideas is bigger than our modeling capacity. And we are by definition going to enter into a stage where if we allow the AI not to do generic stuff, because right now everything is like we're kind of like trying to narrow it down so it just produces stuff that makes sense for us. We don't want it to hallucinate and do weird stuff. I think in the hallucination and in the weird stuff is the real potential for that kind of technology. And I think the interesting, if we come back to your question about why is there so little progress in the idea space, and my theory is that we have, as a culture, reached the capacity of the idea space, of the imaginary horizon, basically. Like our personal human process, possible advance is so little in imagine. I see this in my own process when making music, like trying to imagine something or making something that surprises you, that has not been there idealistically, is super difficult because there's so much. While a hallucinating machine is producing a lot of things that have not been there, but we also don't know what to do with it. So, and maybe I think that's where things are headed. So I'm like more impressed currently by artificial intelligence hallucination than by most human creative expressions. They just surprise me more.
Thank you for sharing your thoughts and your reflections on your creative project. I wonder, you're known also for your collaborations. When you work jointly with someone else on an object, does this picture stay in itself, or how would you describe this process? Maybe 1-2 sentences on this.
It's a very good question, yeah. Because I've not spoken about the potential of the object. Because when you're kind of like envisioning, let's say, a musical object, right? In the beginning, everything is kind of like in a haze, like you're trying to pull things together and like getting a better idea of what this should be. And we also can look at it as like it's this cone. You're like in the center and there's this cone, and the musical idea is like somewhere there. And when you work together with somebody else, normally, in my case, you kind of have shared, before you start working together, a common interest in an object which is in a shared space, I would say. Like you both, or how many people there are, know that you kind of like want to work on something which is in a space you share. It's not random. It's not infinite. It's not like suddenly you're surprised about the other person, but you kind of like know already what there is. And then you start to, very often the best collaborations is you don't even talk about it. You already knew it before. And then you kind of start to approaching that object. And the more you start working on it, the closer it comes. And then there's a moment, and in this process of getting closer to the object, like the human dynamics kind of become important, like how does everybody tick, personal psychology, can you work with that person, can you not work with that person? You may start having an argument or even a fallout, or you may go different directions and so on. Ideal situation, this does not happen. And you suddenly start to realize that this object is coming closer. Until this point, it's still possible that you're having personal adjustments. There's still you and me, and we're in the studio. And I've always felt that there's a moment when this thing crystallizes and becomes like this object where you. And then at this point, I always found a good collaboration is when the collaborators realize that there is this object you're working on. It's like a sculpture. Suddenly it's there. It used to be a rock which was standing there, and then you start chiseling it, and then suddenly you go like, oh, it's, I don't know, it's a lion, or it's, I don't know, David or something like that. And then you kind of like start to have respect for that object because it's already there. Like, and then you have to step back and kind of like as collaborators as well, start to serve that object. That's how I see it. Like, then these differences, they can become destructive. And the most fascinating thing for me when collaborating with people is that when you both, or I don't know, 3, 4 people realize that you're standing in front of something that you have together kind of like manifested or created, and then everybody has the respect towards that object, not towards the others. That's kind of like understood. Now it doesn't matter who I am, who you are, what you want, and what the purpose is, but let's treat this thing with the respect and with the intention we had, and bring it to the conclusion we are able to as a group, or as a duo. So I've always found that very tricky, because of course you're not, when you're alone, it's just kind of like a solitude kind of moment where you suddenly realize, wow, okay, now it's there. Like, you're sitting there for like 10, 12 hours, and then suddenly you have done something that is not that easy to undo. I mean, not talking about erasing, but like, no, actually I want to go back and do it again. This object gets more and more dominant. And when you're alone, it's kind of easy, taking decisions and so on. When you're together, you have, of course, group dynamics, psychology, and all kinds of very complicated things that don't work. In my case, they don't work too often. Like, I have not collaborated too much, and they every single one was very different in terms of approaching the project, or not to speak, of course, I mean, tools. Normally you're synced in the idea space, kind of like, what you want. And it's always been, to me, like kind of like a meta experience. There's the experience of making the music, but then there's the experience of making it with that other person, which I prefer not to treat. I'm very interested in the human aspect of it. I almost enjoy more the moment itself of making music than the music we're making in a way. So I've gotten more interested in that aspect, and it's a new layer, I think. Like, working in groups on music is like, I mean, in talking about classical music, or I don't know, orchestras and stuff like that, is like a super difficult but also a very amazing thing to happen in general. I like it a lot, but it doesn't, in my case, happen too often.
Okay, I think this is it. Thank you so much for this wonderfully interesting.
Thank you.